Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the Almond Board for bringing us together for this meeting and for the invitation to speak here today. My name is Andrew McElrone, and I'm a plant physiologist with USDA based in Davis, California. And I'm here to talk about new tools for ET, so that's evapotranspiration-based irrigation management in almonds. We think about this in the context of water balance, similar to the potted tree shown here, where we ideally will track all of the inputs and outputs of water into the system. Our work is focused largely on developing new tools to more precisely measure ET both on the ground and remotely with UAVs and satellite imagery. The cartoon on the bottom right shows those different scales that I'll be talking about today. I'll start off with the ground-based sensors and then moved into the remotely sensed tools later on in the talk. Such data can help growers to better deal with increasing policy regulations like SGMA by delivering the right amount of water to the trees where and when they need it in order to maximize productivity and increase water use efficiency. In an idealized pot scenario, we can theoretically track all of the water balance components of the system. But in the real world, there's a huge multiplication factor for all of the trees in an orchard and lots of other factors like the list shown here that need to be accounted for. There's inherent factors, things like evaporative demand driven by the local climate, soil types and uniformities, and some decisions that were made when the orchard was originally planted, like variety and rootstocks and spacings, to more dynamic things associated with the biological nature of the system, whether you're managing for cover crops, and then the phenology, age, plant health and nutrition, and things that are related to plant physiology and are illustrated well by the cartoon on the right that need to be accounted for from a management perspective. Ultimately, we're trying to answer three questions when doing ET-based irrigation management. We want to know how much water is needed, when it is needed, and where to irrigate that. How much is associated with the tree water use? When is associated with the tree stress and the state of stress throughout the season? And where is associated with spatial variability? We need new tools in order to approach stress thresholds similar to those that are used during whole split and to achieve optimal production and management goals. As a real-world example, we take this almond orchard located in Madera County with north to south row orientation. It's a 100-acre orchard that is split into two approximately 50-acre parcels, and it has very different variety compositions in the east and west side of this plot and spacing differences based on these variety compositions as well. And yet the whole thing is irrigated all at the same time. And what the growers typically do here is that they're aiming for full ET until they get past nut fill, which is around the third week of June. And then they slowly pull back the nonpareils within here and keep the pollinators at full ET. And they do this by turning off individual rows when needed for a few weeks. So essentially, these rows that go north and south are being treated similarly throughout this, despite inherent differences that can exist along these lines. The plot on the right, which I will describe where this data comes from later in the talk, is an actual ET map for the same site from July 22nd of 2020. And it's at 30-meter resolution, the individual squares in here showing the ET for these individual plots. So ultimately what we want to do is be aware that this data is coming online now at this resolution and much finer, and start to design irrigation systems that will have the capacity to deliver water appropriately to match these needs. The common way that water needs for an almond orchard has been calculated to date has been using the California Irrigation Management Information System, CIMMYS. And what this does is it relates how a well-watered model grass would be using water under the same climatic conditions that your orchard is experiencing. This is then multiplied by a crop coefficient that is specific to almonds. Ultimately, that's been obtained from data from a weighing lysimeter at the Kearney Agricultural Center to get your ETC, or the calculated ET for the site. This data has been then translated to other locations using an IPAR app that Bruce Lampinen and others developed, and it obtains a shaded area on the ground and ultimately relates that to how much radiation the trees are absorbing. And this can tell you how much ET is actually coming off of this. What this model does is it gives you a blanket ET calculated value for your orchard, and it actually assumes that you have disease-free trees grown under optimum soil, water, and nutrient conditions, which we know just from what we've outlined above is not actually the case in the real-world setting. The new tools we are working on all utilize an energy balance approach to quantify an actual ET for the site. We ultimately partition the energy in the system to calculate how much of that is actually going into evaporating water, which is the latent heat flux. So you have the net radiation coming in. Ultimately, the source of that is from the sun. And then that energy gets partitioned into heating the air. So it's absorbed by the canopy. And then as the air moves across that surface, it heats the air and you have energy exchange there. A portion of it goes into heating the ground, which is the ground heat flux. And the remainder that's left over goes into evaporating the water. And this is what we're calculating for the actual ET on the individual sites. So we actually do this on the ground with flux towers. And we also do the same approaches with thermal imagery from UAVs and from satellites. Much of our ground-based efforts is focused on calculating sensible heat flux and quantifying that in more effective ways. This illustration on the top, a short video, shows the energy exchange processes that would be happening over a crop surface. You have a wind moving from the left to the right on the screen. You can imagine it moving over your almond orchard. It's moving slowly towards the bottom of the screen because of the interaction of the friction of the air moving across that surface. And then what happens is illustrated where this video stopped at the end, is that you have ejection events of large parcels of energy actually moving as the air parcels move in and out of this. And you can see 3 of these that popped up right towards the end of this video. So with these methods, what we need to account for is the wind direction, because you have the station located at the center of this, which is illustrated by the cartoon tower, is picking up the flux that's coming across this area of land that's represented in the northwest portion of this windrose compass that's shown on this. So we must position the tower in a location that will account for the prevailing wind. One method that we've worked on extensively for measuring the sensible heat flux in the system is surface renewal, which was originally developed by Chautapau at UC Davis. This theoretical representation shows how air parcels come in contact with the canopy, shown in the upper left with the light colored cube. It starts to heat up, so it's receiving energy from that canopy. And you see that reflected in the temperature trace just below this, where the temperature is increasing. And then the system in the third picture, actually, the surface gets renewed, where a new cube that is cooler comes into the system, bumps out the existing cube of air, or that parcel of air, and you get a temperature drop at this point. And this happens repeatedly over and over. So we actually measure this with fine wire thermocouples that are shown in the image on the right, and they are very delicate sensors that need to be protected in the field. Tom Chaplin was a PhD student in my lab that worked collaboratively with Chauta and Rick Snyder, and he figured out the math of exactly where the exchange was occurring in the temperature trace that's shown in actual data on the bottom figure. He removed the need for expensive calibrations and ultimately moved this into a commercial system that is now out and available for growers to use. Building on the success of his dissertation research, Tom moved the product into the marketplace with funding from Silicon Valley. This technology has received a lot of awards, and ultimately what he did was take an expensive research grade system and create a commercial system that actually provides growers with actual ET values from their specific plot on the ground. We calibrated this against the weighing lysimeter when grapes were still growing in it. We've been doing a lot of work on almonds at the same site for it. And we've also done this with a soil water budget approach in order to move this forward. So this tool actually uses these energy balance approaches and feeds that data to growers, giving them information both about the water use and the water stress that's coming off of these systems. There are other companies that have moved into this space as well and developed similar type of sensing technology. One example is Arable, and there's an image shown here of the Arable mark that uses energy balance approaches in order to know what the water inputs and the water outputs of the system were, as we described above. Ultimately, we'd really like to get multiple bits of information from any one type of sensor technology that we're using. So there's lots of different ways that we can track water components in the system to get at the when or the stress aspects of this. And so we have pyrometry or pressure bombing to do that. You have aerial imagery and stress indices, some of these that I'll talk a bit more about going forward. But ultimately, we want to combine the how much. So can we figure out how much water is coming off the surface and when to apply it based on the stress using a single sensor? Infrared sensors shown in the bottom have actually been used for many decades. in order to track water stress in plants using similar energy balance approaches at the individual leaf level that's shown at the cartoon on the right. We've done work with these sensors to check how these stress indices work in other woody crops. This is shown here for grapevines on the right. That shows a canopy stomatal conductance that's calculated from the canopy temperatures that come from these IRT sensors compared to leaf stomatal conductance that was actually measured on these, and we got good relations between these. Because the fine wire thermocouples that are used for measuring the air temperature above the canopy for surface renewal applications, as shown in the temperature trace on the bottom of this, are so delicate, those thermocouples are so delicate that they need to be protected in a cage, we were actually looking for other ways to, with more rugged sensors like the IRT sensors, to see if we could actually capture some of these same events. There's a temperature trace shown from the canopy temperature that we were measuring at 1 hertz in red at the top of this relative to the air temperature measured right above that canopy at the same time. And you can actually see those same ramp-like features that I was describing before for surface renewal. So what we realized by doing these high-resolution canopy temperature measurements is that we can actually pick up the water use from the sensible heat flux portion of this relatively well as get at the stress indices at the same time, giving us a ground-based sensor that would actually pair very well with what's actually happening for the remotely sensed tools. In order to test the IRT wavelet method that we developed, we actually take these IRTs across various cropping surfaces shown on the image on the left with alfalfa, almonds, and grapevines tested. We actually did this at the weighing lysimeter with the tree that's actually being measured very precisely in terms of its water use and tracked what we got from that. The image on the bottom right shows our output from eddy covariance, so our flux estimates of how much water is coming off of it from eddy covariance and surface renewal versus this new wavelet method where we're actually tracking the sensible heat flux using these IRT sensors pointed at the canopy itself. And you can see that the wavelet in blue is actually matching up very well with the gold standard eddy covariance that we actually measure in the system. And then the plot on the left shows the sensible heat flux, so that's the H, from the wavelet method versus the sensible heat flux from eddy covariance that's measured on the x-axis, the bottom axis on this, showing a very good relationship for this across these different cropping surfaces. We're really excited about this because it gives us the potential to measure both the water use in the system as well as the water stress that I just mentioned, and really giving us a rugged method in order to ground truth remotely sensed tools that I'll go on to describe in the rest of the talk. We are patenting this, and we hope to get this out there in terms of an easy to use system that growers can tap into for measuring individual tree water use within their plots. Now I'm going to transition to the remotely sensed applications, similar using energy balance partitioning to determine the ET in these systems. So ultimately what we're doing is using thermal imagery from satellites and drones at different heights in order to partition the ET, so how much evaporation is coming from the soil as shown in the cartoon on the left versus the tree's transpiration. And you can get very different conditions based on the types of irrigation that's put in. If you have flood irrigation where water is being more uniformly delivered over the surface of the orchard versus drip, which gives you a localized profile. So what scientists on this team, Bill Kustis and Martha Anderson from the Hydrology and Remote Sensing Lab in Beltsville, Maryland, have been able to do is amazingly take two-dimensional images from the satellites and the UAVs and use a two-source energy balance approach that accounts for the sensible heat flux from the ground as well as that from the canopy. And in doing this, they can actually calculate the ET of the system very effectively. We've been doing this work in the context of the GrapeX project, the Grape Remote Sensing, Atmospheric Profiling, and Evapotranspiration Experiment. It's a mouthful, and it's a partnership between a lot of research institutions. USDA, this has been led by Bill Kustis and Martha Anderson and the folks at the Hydrology and Remote Sensing Lab. You have ARS folks here at Davis, as well as our university partners, NASA, Cal State Monterey Bay, Utah State for the Aggie Air Team, and then our commercial partners who have been really instrumental in getting this work done, E&J Gallo. So ultimately what we're trying to do is refine and apply a multi-scale remote sensing ET toolkit for mapping the crop water use and stress to improve irrigation management in California. Something that's very exciting about this is that there's a new USDA Sustainable Agricultural Water Resources unit here in Davis that's just been developed. And we were able to hire Kyle Knipper, who was actually running these models as a postdoc. And now he's going to be a scientist that's based here in Davis, running these models for woody perennial crops in California. What we do in the Great Bags project is actually ground truth these models, the two-source energy balance approach models that are from the remote sensed data. And we have towers on the ground that are actually shown on the left-hand side, where we're actually getting the atmospheric profile of how that air is interacting with the surface. And we really measure the hell out of the system. We put all sorts of sensors into here, sap flow sensors. We're measuring leaf area indices. We have IRT stations for measuring the canopy temperatures and doing some of the wavelet analysis, and surface renewal stations, as well as the eddy flux and soil moisture throughout this. And then when passing over, we actually have these intensive observational periods, the IOPs, where we do a lot of additional measurements on the ground to ground truth and compare what we're actually measuring on the ground with what's happening when the UAVs and the satellites are actually above. The Landsat data that we actually use for the 30 by 30 meter pixel resolution data is then compared against what we get from UAVs. And we've been working with Utah State's Aggie Air team, and Alfonso Torres is leading that team now. An example of the mapping that comes out of this is shown on the left, where we can actually use the two-source energy balance model to separate out the vines from the inter-row spaces, which would be similar to an almond orchard. These UAVs can actually give us data at much finer resolution and can fly more frequently. So they can go centimeter scale resolution. They fly at different heights with a bi-wing plane, where Alfonso is shown there on the right, versus these quadcopters. And really, I think this is ultimately where we're going to be heading in terms of ETA mapping. So actual ET mapping of where you'll actually have individual drones that will be able to go out to these sites and do this on a regular basis to provide this type of data for irrigation management. Coming back to that satellite-based data from the Landsat images, this is 3 images across the top from 2014 through 2016 of the first site of where we were actually doing this in vineyards with Gallo. So there were actually 2 orchards that were adjacent with very different canopy types that are shown in the site images that are down on the bottom right. And the site is located in Lodi, California. So the plots of ET over that time are shown in the bottom left. And you see this for the north vineyard that has a much larger canopy versus the south vineyard. And the red dots are what was actually measured on the ground with the flux towers. And then the solid gray line is what was modeled for that site. And that's a site average for there. The gray, the lighter gray that goes around that, actually shows the spatial variability that we actually get. So this shows the ET and how much it can vary within this plot when you map it out to 30 by 30 meter pixel resolution. And what we actually need to account for in terms of irrigation management is that variability in order to increase our precision management strategies in these systems. What we can ultimately see is that the model is matching up very well with this, and this type of data is now coming online, as I'll describe at the end of the talk. We've also done this work with Gallo in a plot down in Ripperdan, which is in Madera County, and we partner with them because they have a variable rate irrigation system that has 30 by 30 meter pixel resolution for irrigation delivery that matches the Landsat pixels that we're using. So in this example that I'll show you over the next few slides is we're providing weekly total ET for irrigation decision support, and we were aiming for more stress in the upper parts, so in blocks 1 and 2, actually shown in the bottom image on the right, and then aiming for no stress in plot number 3 and a moderate stress as we approached an IOP date in the late portions of the summer down in that bottom 4th block. This is an example of data across the top, shows the calendar. This is from the week of early week in June from this plot. And you have the prescribed irrigation that was going in based on the ET and based on what we were targeting for our stress. So the middle 38.5 acres is actually these 4 plots that I was showing you. So you can imagine a crosshair in the center of that, splitting it into 4, and then the delivery. So you had relatively uniform conditions here, and then we started to prescribe different irrigation levels in order to impose those stresses that I showed on. As we move into July, you can see the prescribed irrigation that is based on what we know is coming off the surface in terms of ET and what we need to put back in based on those stress estimates. and you start to see divergence in the system. And by the time we reached the point late in July where we really wanted to impose significant stress differences, you really see that you got a drastic separation between the northern portions of the plot and the southern portions where we were aiming for no or moderate stress in these. We then had to ramp back up irrigation here because we actually pushed the system pretty hard, but we were able to see that from the ET output as well as what we were measuring on the ground. We're now very excited to extend this work into tree crops. We're actually establishing towers right now in 3 commercial orchards with partners both in the Sacramento Valley as well as the San Joaquin Valley. And we're calling this project T-REX. So this is our tree crop remote sensing of evapotranspiration experiment. So doing the same ground truthing efforts of these remotely sensed tools against what we actually measure on the ground. We got a CDFA specialty crop block grant and funding from the Almond Board of California in order to develop these tools and start to map this and ground truth these models that are actually coming online soon. Output from both the GrapeX and the T-REX model is actually going to be available through this incredible collaborative project called OpenET, which is being run by a guy, Forrest Melton, at Cal State Monterey Bay. And it involves a lot of folks, the Environmental Defense Fund, NASA, and Google Earth Engine, that have put a lot of resources into these tools. And what they're actually aiming to do with OpenET is to provide reliable ET data that's produced and available at very low cost and is easily accessible through etdata.org. So this is actually coming online. It was set to come online in December of 2020, and it's been a little bit delayed with COVID, but this will be out. And you can see a plot there that shows in the inverted droplet of the individual plots of land where you'll be able to go in on a weekly basis and actually see the data that's coming out from these remotely sensed models. So ultimately, this was more of a policy tool when it was first developed, but then growers actually said that this would be really helpful for them in terms of managing irrigation. And there are some team members from E&J Gallo and others from the Almond Board that are actually working closely with the OpenET team in order to deliver this data to you for your individual. So OpenET actually uses well-established models. So the model that we use in GrapeX and T-REX are Alexi, Disalexi, that is shown down in the bottom. But there's actually 6 that are embedded in OpenET that are all well-founded in the science. And we are ground truthing all of these within the system and comparing against that output that will come out from the OpenET system with what we're doing in T-REX for you. So ultimately, what I've shown here is that we have new tools for answering these questions about how much and when. So we know the tree water use from both ground-based and remotely sensed, and the water stress from these same types of tools. Ultimately, what we now need is things to get at the spatial variability of where to deliver that water. So WaterBit was actually working on this, and they've recently been acquired by FarmX. But all the rest of the irrigation designers in the audience is that there's a lot of room here because of the new data that's coming out in terms of the how much and when, is that we need systems that will be able to deliver this water more effectively to account for that spatial variability. There are a lot of people that have been involved in this work throughout a long period of time, and this list actually goes here, and I'd be happy to take any questions associated with the talk. Thanks for your attention.